She came hauling 3 kids and a broke-down life, and the last man on the range found something worth fighting for. I rode out that Tuesday in October with nothing on my mind but a busted fence line on the north boundary, and the particular misery of doing cold weather work alone. The Arroyo Flats Road runs straight as a rifle barrel across 6 miles of sage and caliche before it bends south toward Drover's Notch, and I knew every rut and stone of it the way a man knows the ache in an old wound. I'd ridden it alone for 6 years. 6 years since Clara passed, and in all that time I had organized my life into a narrow and manageable shape. The cattle, the fence line, the cook stove at night, and the particular silence of a house that has forgotten the sound of voices. I was not looking for anything to change that. The wagon was sitting half in the road ditch, one rear wheel canted at an angle that told me everything before I got close enough to see the split axle. A woman stood beside it with her arms folded and her chin up, and 3 children sat on top of a tarp-covered load in the wagon bed like passengers waiting on a stalled train. The oldest was a boy who looked about 12, square-shouldered and still, already trying to hold himself the way a man does when there are no men present. The middle child was a girl maybe 9, dark-braided and watchful. The smallest, a boy, I thought, though the oversized coat made it hard to tell, was 4 or 5, sitting with a patience that didn't belong on a face that young. I pulled up and took off my hat. The woman looked at me, the way people look at whether they haven't decided yet whether to trust. "Axle," I said. "Cracked through," she said. "Right rear, happened about 2 hours ago." "How far back?" She tipped her head toward the north. "Mile and a half, maybe 2. I got it this far before it gave out entirely." I looked at the wheel again. The axle had sheared at the hub, a clean break, the kind that doesn't happen all at once but builds from a hairline crack over miles of bad road. She'd been driving it lame for longer than 2 hours, I figured. She'd been driving it lame and hadn't stopped until she had to. "You got kin in Drover's Notch?" I said. "No. Headed there regardless." She paused before she answered, and the pause told me what the answer meant. "Headed somewhere," she said. "I'll figure out the rest when I get there." I put my hat back on. There was a particular kind of pride in her answer, not the brittle kind that breaks when you push it, but the load-bearing kind. The kind a person develops when they've been managing everything alone for long enough that asking for help feels like losing something they can't afford to lose. "My name's Amos Kettrick," I said. "I've got a ranch 2 miles east. I can get the wagon into my yard, leave it there while you ride into Drover's Notch for a wheelwright. Clovis Dern does axle work, takes him 2 days usually. My ranch isn't the town, but it's shelter and it's closer." She studied me with that weather-watching expression. "And what do you want for the trouble?" "Nothing," I said. She didn't like that answer. I could see it, the slight tightening around her jaw that meant charity tasted sour to her. "I won't take a gift," she said, "not from a stranger." "All right," I said. "You can muck out my barn while you wait. I've been short-handed since September." The oldest boy made a small sound that might have been a laugh he caught just in time. The woman's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the edge of one. "Your barn's that bad," she said. "My barn," I said, "is a disgrace." She looked at her children. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the sky, which was starting to go the particular gray-yellow color that means weather is building somewhere to the northwest, and on the Arroyo Flats you take that color seriously. "Della Marsh," she said. "My children are Cal, Emmy, and Toby." "Mrs. Marsh?" "Just Della. I've been Mrs. Marsh for 2 years without a Mr. Marsh, and it doesn't fit right anymore." I tied my horse to the wagon and we worked together to unhitch her team from the broken rig. She knew horses. She didn't wait for instruction and she didn't fumble with the harness. I noticed, because I notice these things. A person who knows horses has generally had to earn that knowledge the hard way. We got her team hitched to my saddle horse in a rough arrangement. It wasn't elegant, but it would hold for 2 miles. The children climbed down from the wagon bed without being asked, the oldest boy taking the youngest's hand automatically, and they walked alongside while I led the horses. Della walked too. She didn't ride when her children were walking. That was the first thing I saw in her that I didn't expect. My ranch is called the Kettrick Place, which is what Clara always called it because she said naming a ranch after something romantic was tempting fate. She was practical that way. I loved her for it, and after she died I kept the name just as she'd given it, because it was one of the few things that still sounded like her voice. The yard is nothing to look at in October. The cottonwood along the creek has gone yellow and is dropping fast, and the outbuildings carry that particular gray-weathered look that makes everything seem older than it is. But the house is sound, Clara insisted on that, and the barn, whatever I'd said about its condition, was solid enough. Just neglected. Della's children stood in the yard and looked around in the way children do when they're deciding whether a place is safe. Toby, the littlest, pressed against his mother's leg without making a production of it. Emmy turned in a slow circle, studying everything. Cal stood a few paces ahead of the others and looked at the barn and the corrals with an expression I recognized. He was calculating how much work there was and whether he could do it. "I'll get a fire in the stove," I said. "Main house has a guest room. You and the girl can have that. I'll put cots in the bunk room for the boys." "We don't need the guest room," Della said immediately. "There's nowhere else that's warm," I said. "The bunk room's heated from the same stack as the main house. The guest room is the only other room with a window that doesn't let weather through. It's not hospitality, it's geometry." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Emmy, who was starting to shiver in a way she was trying to hide. "Fine," Della said, "but we're working tomorrow, all of us." "I'll have more than enough work for all of you," I said, which was the truth. There are things you forget when you've lived alone long enough. You forget that a cook stove sounds different when there's someone else in the kitchen. Not louder, just different, the way a room sounds when it's got a purpose again. You forget that children's voices carry through walls in a particular way, not the sharp carrying of sound in an empty house, but something rounder, something that fills the corners. You forget that food cooked for more than one person smells different from food cooked for yourself. Della cooked supper that first night without being asked, and without asking where things were. She simply moved through my kitchen, opened the right cupboards on the second try, found the salt, found the lard, found the cornmeal, and in 40 minutes produced something from my half-bare larder that I wouldn't have thought possible. I sat at the kitchen table and watched her with a feeling I couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and alarm. She put plates in front of all 3 children before she sat down herself. That was the second thing. "Where are you from?" I asked during supper. "North," she said, "Garrett County. We had a small place there, hog operation mostly." "What happened to it?" She didn't look up from her plate. "My husband, Orlin, died 2 winters ago, fever. The bank held a note on the property and they weren't inclined to renegotiate it with a widow." She said it flatly, the way a person says a thing they've had to say too many times for it to still hurt when they say it. I held on another year and then I didn't. Cal, the oldest, was watching me across the table to see how I took this. I kept my face plain, because he needed to see that it was plain information and not something to be ashamed of. "Where are you headed?" I said. "Haverfield County," she said. "I have a letter from a woman I know there who has a boarding house. She said there might be work." She said this carefully, like a person describing a plan that they know is thin, but that they've decided to believe in anyway, because the believing is the only part under their control. I didn't say anything about the thinness of the plan. It wasn't my place. 2 days for the axle, I said. Maybe 3 if Clovis is backlogged. 3 days is fine, she said. We'll earn it. They did. Cal was up before me the next morning. I found him in the barn with a pitchfork he'd found against the wall, working through the nearest stall with the calm, methodical efficiency of a boy who has been doing barn work since before he was big enough to lift the fork properly. He'd adapted his technique to his size, short strokes, a little at a time, but steady. "You don't have to start yet," I said. "Sun's barely up." "We're earning our keep," he said, which was exactly what his mother would have said. I didn't argue. I handed him a pair of work gloves from a peg on the wall because his were thin, and he took them without comment, and we worked the barn together for 2 hours before Emmy appeared in the door to say breakfast was ready. It turned out that Della had made biscuits from the last of my flour, and a gravy from the bacon ends in the smokehouse that she'd found by way of a thorough investigation of my stores. She'd also made a list, on a piece of brown paper from the wrapping on the bacon, of everything in my larder that needed replacing. She set the list beside my plate with the coffee. "You're low on most things," she said. "I generally am by this time of year," I said. "I ride into Drover's Notch every few weeks." "You've been riding in too infrequently," she said. This was stated as fact, not as criticism, the way you'd tell a man his fence wire is going slack, noting the condition, not assigning blame. "When were you last in?" "September sometime." "It's October." "I'm aware." She drank her coffee and didn't say anything more about it. That was the third thing I noticed about her. She didn't push past what was useful to say. She said what needed saying, and then she let it be. I sent Cal and Emmy into Drover's Notch that morning in the light wagon I kept for town runs, old enough that I didn't mind them handling it, with a letter to Clovis Dern about the axle, and enough money to replace the flour and the other items on Della's list. I told Cal to bring back whatever Clovis said about the timeline. Cal asked me twice to make sure he had the address of the smithy, and then he went without needing to be told anything else. While they were gone, I showed Della the fence line on the eastern pasture that had been pulling my attention for 3 weeks. She walked it with me and spotted 2 bad posts I'd missed. She had a good eye. "You do all this alone," she said. "Since my wife passed," I said, 6 years. She didn't say she was sorry. I'd had enough of people being sorry. Instead, she said, "That's a lot of land for one man." "It is," I said. "Were you ever going to fix those posts?" "Eventually," she said, which somehow conveyed a complete opinion without a single additional word. We fixed the posts that afternoon, the 2 of us, while Toby sat on the fence rail and handed us things and felt useful. He had a serious way of handing over tools, both hands careful, as though the importance of the task was the most important thing in the world. I hadn't spent much time around a child that small since Clara and I hadn't had children, not for lack of wanting. Toby handed me a staple with both hands, very carefully, and looked up at me with pale brown eyes that had seen more than a 4-year-old's eyes should. "Kettrick," he said, "not Mr. Kettrick. Just Kettrick, the way old cowboys address each other." "Yes," I said. "Is your horse's name a name?" "His name is Judas," I said. Toby thought about this. "That's a mean name," he said. "He's a mean horse," I said. "Maybe he's mean because of the name," Toby said. I didn't have an answer for that. Cal came back from Drover's Notch with the flour and the other supplies and a note from Clovis Dern that said the axle would take 4 days, not 2, because he'd just taken in a big repair job from the livery and the marsh wagon would have to wait its turn. He also brought, without being asked, 2 pounds of coffee and a jar of hard candy, which he'd purchased with a small amount of his own money. Where he'd gotten it I didn't know, and I didn't ask. He gave the candy to Emmy and Toby, and kept nothing for himself. I told Della about the 4 days. She received this information with the same expression she'd received everything else, steady, no complaint. Then she said, "Then we have 4 days' worth of work to do," and went back to the stove. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that surprised me by how quickly it settled into something that felt like it had always been there. Della and Cal worked the barn and the fence and the corrals. Emmy took over the keeping of the house with a thoroughness that was almost alarming. She swept and aired and reorganized things without asking, and the kitchen was cleaner by the third morning than it had been since Clara. Toby followed me. This last development I had not planned for and did not know how to address. He simply appeared at my elbow each morning when I went out to the corrals and stayed there, quiet as a shadow, handing me things when I needed them and sitting on whatever was available when I didn't. He didn't demand conversation. He offered it in small doses, observations about the horses, questions about the land, the occasional piece of information about himself delivered without preamble. I used to have a dog named Vessel, and seemed perfectly content when I responded in kind. I had not been followed around by anyone in a very long time. The fourth morning he said, "Do you get lonely?" I was checking the cinch on Judas, who was being unpleasant about it, and I kept my attention on the horse while I considered the question. "Sometimes," I said. "Mama says sometimes loneliness is just the quiet asking for something," Toby said. I looked at him then. He was sitting on the water trough with his feet dangling, perfectly serious. "Your mama say that often," I said. "When she thinks we're asleep," he said. "She talks to Papa sometimes. At night, we don't tell her we can hear." I didn't say anything. I finished with the cinch and led Judas out into the yard. On the evening of the third day, Della found me on the porch. I'd been sitting there with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the sky go dark over the Arroyo Flats, which is the one thing about this country that nobody disputes. The sky at dusk is worth every difficulty the day brings. She came out without her coat and stood at the porch rail with her arms folded against the cold, looking at the same sky. "You don't have to stand out in the cold," I said. "I'm not cold," she said, which was plainly untrue. Her breath was misting. I got up and went inside and came back with the old wool blanket I kept on the rocker and put it around her shoulders. She took it without arguing, which I counted as a small concession. "Cal asked me tonight if we had to leave on Saturday," she said. I waited. I told him yes, she said, "we do." "You do if Clovis is done with the axle," I said. "He might not be." She turned to look at me. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't soften the edges for my sake. If the axle's done on Saturday, we leave on Saturday. That's the arrangement." "That's the arrangement," I agreed. She turned back to the sky. A long silence settled, the kind that has some weight to it. "This was Orland's land too once," she said. "Not this land, land like it. He used to stand just like this and look at whatever was in front of him and not say anything, and I couldn't tell if he was at peace or just tired." She paused. "I could always tell with him, eventually. He'd reach over and take my hand if he was at peace. If he was just tired, he'd go inside." I didn't say anything. "I'm not telling you that for any particular reason," she said. "I'm just talking." "That's all right," I said. The cold deepened. She pulled the blanket tighter. Neither of us went inside. After a while she said, "Your wife, what was she like?" "Practical," I said. "She thought naming a ranch after something romantic was tempting fate." Della made a short sound, barely audible, not quite a laugh. "Smart woman." "The smartest I ever knew," I said. "Until recently." I hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before I'd decided to say it, the way things do when you've been alone too long and you've forgotten to keep the gate closed. Della didn't say anything, but she didn't go inside either. Clovis Dern sent word on Friday morning that the axle would be ready Saturday by noon. I went out to the barn early that morning and found Cal already at work, same as every morning. But this morning he was working slower. Not lazily, methodically, but with the particular drag of a person doing something for the last time and not wanting to finish it. I worked alongside him without commenting on it. After a while he said, "Is there work here, regular work?" I kept pitching. What do you mean? I mean, is there work enough here for a person to do regularly? A person who comes back. I looked at him then. He was 12 years old, which is old enough that some things need to be said straight. There's more work here than I can do alone, I said. There always has been. He nodded and went back to work. We didn't talk about it again. That evening Della made the last supper from what remained in the larder, which was more than it had been when she arrived, because of what Cal had brought back from Drover's Notch, and because she had a gift for stretching what was there. A beef stew with the root vegetables from my root cellar, corn bread, dried apple slices that Emmy had arranged on a plate in a careful pattern, as though the occasion called for something that looked intentional. Toby climbed into the chair next to mine, the one he'd claimed on the first night and returned to every meal since, and sat with his hands in his lap waiting for supper to be served. "Are we going tomorrow?" he asked the room. "Yes," Della said from the stove. Toby considered this. "Can Kettrick come?" "Kettrick lives here," Della said. "He could come anyway," Toby said, "if he wanted." "Toby," Cal said quietly. "I'm just saying," Toby said. I looked at the table. I looked at Toby's serious face and Emmy's careful apple arrangement and Cal's deliberate steadiness. I looked at Della's back, at the straight line of her spine at the stove, at the way she held herself, not tense, just upright, the way a person holds themselves when they're carrying something they're used to carrying and they've decided not to put it down. I had spent 6 years building a life that didn't ask anything of me except that I maintain it. I had done that. I had maintained it. I had gotten up every morning and done the work and gone to bed at night and not asked for anything beyond the next day, because asking for anything beyond the next day was how you got your heart set on fire. I looked at that straight spine at the stove, and I thought about 6 more years of the same, and something in my chest, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, made itself known. I didn't say anything at supper, but I didn't sleep that night either. Saturday morning came in with a clear sky and a cold that had some teeth to it, the kind of October cold that's reminding you December is not far behind. I was up before the sun, which is nothing unusual, but I was dressed and outside and walking the property line along the creek before anyone else was stirring, which was unusual. I was thinking. A man has to be careful about what he thinks and when, because thinking at the wrong time and in the wrong direction can lead him to conclusions that are built on the moment and not on anything solid. I had learned this about myself. I had learned to wait for the cool part of the reasoning, after the warm part passed. I walked the creek line until the sky went pink and the cottonwoods caught the first light and turned gold, and I went through what I knew instead of what I felt, because what I felt was unreliable and what I knew was not. What I knew. Della Marsh was a grown woman with 3 children and a plan, thin as it was, and a fierce and particular pride that was not decoration but structure. It was the thing holding her together. She was not a woman who could be offered things. She had made that plain from the first hour. She was a woman who traded fair, who worked honest, and who would not accept a gift that felt like pity. What I knew, the plan she had was thin. A letter from a woman in Haverfield County who had said there might be work. Might. A boarding house. 3 children and a broken wagon newly repaired and a road that still had 80 miles on it before she reached anywhere promising. What I knew. This ranch needed what she could give it, and she needed what it could give back, and those were 2 facts that could be stated plainly without any warmth in them at all. What I knew. The warmth was there anyway, and pretending otherwise was something I was no longer willing to spend the energy on. I went back to the house and made coffee and waited. She came into the kitchen a little after sunrise, already dressed for travel, her hair put up. She stopped when she saw me at the table, reading something in my expression. I don't know what it was, but she saw something. "Coffee's ready," I said. She poured a cup and sat across from me. "I want to say something," I said. I want to say it plainly and you can answer it plainly, and that's all either of us needs to do." She set down her cup. She gave me her full attention in the way she gave everything her full attention, direct, without fidgeting. "You've got a plan," I said. "I'm not saying your plan is wrong, it might work fine. But it's thin, and the road is long, and Haverfield County is 80 miles, and that's 80 miles in late October on a wagon with a fresh repaired axle." "I know all of that," she said. "I know you know it," I said. "This is not about whether you know it. This is about a practical proposal from a man with a practical problem." I kept my hands flat on the table because I was aware they wanted to do something other than be still, and I didn't want to give that away yet. I need a hand who knows land and stock and can work a ranch. I need someone who can keep a house from becoming what it's been for 6 years. I need more than one person. And you need a solid situation for your children instead of a boarding house and a maybe. I paused. The children can have the guest room proper. Cal's old enough to work a real wage. Emmy and Toby can have the run of the place. Winter's coming and this house is warm and this larder is full, and I am asking you to stay on and work it as a proper arrangement, fair wage, fair terms, nothing that isn't agreed between us." She was quiet for a long moment. "That's the practical proposal," she said. "Yes," I said. "And is there a part that isn't practical?" I looked at her. She looked back at me, steady, unafraid. "There's a part that isn't practical," I said, "but I'm not asking you to do anything about that part. I'm asking you to stay because the practical part is real and it stands on its own, and anything else is something that happens or doesn't in its own time, and you have no obligation to it." She was quiet for longer this time, long enough that I heard the wind pick up outside, heard the cottonwoods moving, heard the particular sound of the ranch in the morning, the horses stirring, the cattle somewhere distant, the whole working weight of the place coming alive. "A fair wage," she said. "A fair wage. And I say how the kitchen is run." "I would not presume," I said. The edge of something moved across her face, not quite a smile yet, getting there. "And you'll tell me straight when something isn't working," she said. "I won't have a man who holds his peace and builds up a grievance." "I'll tell you straight," I said. "And I'll tell you straight when something isn't working," she said, "and you won't take it wrong." "I'll try not to. Try harder than that." "All right," I said, "I'll manage it." She picked up her coffee cup. She looked out the window at the morning coming in cold and clear across the Arroyo Flats. She looked for a long time. "Toby will be insufferable about this," she said. "He'll feel vindicated," I said. She did smile then. It was a brief and private thing, gone almost before it arrived, but I had been watching and I caught it. "Fine," she said. "We'll stay through winter on the arrangement. After that, we'll talk about what comes next." "After winter," I said, "is soon enough." That was the beginning of it, not the end, just the honest beginning of what would take most of the winter to become what it became. Della stayed, and Cal stayed, and Emmy stayed, and Toby stayed, and the Kettrick place, which had been maintained and nothing more for 6 years, began the slow business of being lived in again. This is not a simple thing, and I don't want to make it sound simple. A woman with 3 children and a year of hard road behind her does not set down her wariness all at once, and she shouldn't. A man who has kept his feeling years locked away behind a door he stopped checking doesn't suddenly discover that the door was open all along. That isn't how it works. What actually happened was slower and less dramatic, and I think more real for it. What happened was November. November on the Arroyo Flats is the month when the country decides what kind of winter it's going to be. The sky goes heavy and stays there, and the cold stops being the playful cold of October and becomes something with intention. The cattle need more attention, the horses need more attention, the windmill needs attention, and the firewood situation becomes a daily concern rather than a weekly one. Della handled November like she'd been handling it all her life, which she had. Garrett County winters are not gentle either, and she had managed one without a husband and 1.5 without help. She knew what the turning season asked for, and she met it. What I didn't expect was how much she knew about cattle. I knew she'd had a hog operation. I did not know that before the hogs, she and Orlin had run a small beef herd, and that she had done more of the actual cattle work than I would have assumed. When the temperature dropped in the first week of November and I went out to check on the herd and found her already there, before the sun was fully up, in the cold that had dropped overnight to something serious, checking the animals with a practiced eye, noting which ones were off their feed, which ones had drainage from their eyes that would need watching. I stood at the fence and watched her and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like I was not doing the work alone. That sounds small, it wasn't. Cal worked like a man twice his age and asked nothing in return except to be treated like one. I treated him like one. We fell into a working partnership that was almost wordless. He understood the rhythm of the ranch quickly, as though some part of him had been waiting for a rhythm to attach to, and he met it. I started paying him at the end of each week, a fair wage for a man's work, and he took it without false modesty and without pride either, just put it in his pocket and went back to whatever he'd been doing. The third week of November he came to me in the evening and said, "I'd like to learn more about the cattle side, the breeding decisions, the herd management, if you're willing to teach it." "I'm willing," I said. "Good," he said, and went to bed. Emmy reorganized my entire filing situation, such as it was, which is to say a box of crumpled papers and receipts on a shelf in the back room, without being asked. She presented me one evening with a neat stack of papers organized by month and type and said, "I left the ones I couldn't figure out in a separate pile." There were 3 papers in the separate pile. Everything else was in perfect order. "How did you know how to do that?" I asked. "Papa taught me," she said. "He said somebody has to know where everything is, and it might as well be someone careful." I looked at the neat stack of papers. "Your papa was right," I said. Emmy nodded, satisfied, and left. Toby continued to follow me everywhere, which I had stopped resisting. He was quiet company, as children went, content to observe, content to hand over tools, content to sit on whatever surface was available and think his thoughts. Occasionally he announced what he'd been thinking, which was sometimes startling and sometimes oddly wise, and almost always more interesting than anything I would have come up with myself. The end of November he said, while handing me a wrench, "Kettrick, do you think a person can have 2 homes?" "What do you mean?" I said. "Like the home you come from," he said, "and a home you make, are they both real?" I tightened the bolt and set the wrench down and looked at him. He was watching me with those serious pale eyes. "I think they're both real," I said. "The one you come from is the one that makes you who you are. The one you make is the one you decide to be." He thought about this for some time. "I like it here," he said. "I know," I said. "I think Mama does too," he said. "She doesn't talk to Papa as much at night anymore." I picked the wrench back up and went back to work, because there are things a man has to pretend not to have heard, for everyone's dignity. December came in on a north wind that meant business. The first real storm of the season hit the Arroyo Flats on the 4th of December, which is early even by this country's hard standards. I'd seen it building for 2 days. The way the horses got restless, the way the cattle started bunching on the south side of the pasture, the way the sky went the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon. I told Della the morning before it hit. She didn't argue about the severity of it. She asked what needed to be done before it arrived, and we made a list, and we did every item on the list. Cal helped with the outside work. Emmy took charge of the house stores. By the time the snow started in the early afternoon, the cattle were in the lower pasture with the windbreak. The horses were all in. The barn was secured. The root cellar was re-inventoried, and there was enough firewood on the porch to last 2 weeks. When the storm came in earnest, it came hard. By evening, the world outside the windows was nothing but white and wind, and the house was an island. We sat around the cook stove, all 5 of us, which felt in that moment exactly right. And the children played a card game that Emmy had invented some rules for, and Cal disputed some rules of. And Della and I sat on opposite sides of the table with cups of coffee and watched the storm do its work. "Good timing," she said. "Could have been worse," I said. "This time of year it usually is." "You've been through this alone before," she said. 11 of the last 12 years, I said. "That one year Clara was here." She was quiet. Outside the wind shifted and threw a sheet of snow against the window, and the lamp guttered slightly and steadied. "You must miss her," Della said, not as a question. "Every day," I said. "Less sharp than it was, but every day." She nodded. She understood that kind of statement, the difference between the sharp grief and the settled grief, the way you can carry something a long time and still carry it. "Orlin wasn't a complicated man," she said after a while. "He was good and he worked hard and he loved us. I didn't know how much of the weight he was carrying until it was all mine." She turned her cup in her hands. "You think you know how much a person is doing. You don't. Not until they're gone." "No," I said, "you don't." The children's card game reached some kind of disputed climax, and Cal and Emmy argued with the cheerful intensity of children who are not actually angry, and Toby declared himself the winner on grounds that nobody else seemed to understand, but that he stated with complete confidence. Della looked at them, and something moved across her face, not grief, not joy exactly, but something between, something that held both at once. "This is a good house," she said quietly. "Not to me, really. To herself or to the house or to Orlin. It's a good house and they're all right." I didn't say anything. Some things don't need a response. The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, the sky came out clean and blue, and the Arroyo Flats lay under 2 feet of new snow that the wind had sculpted into shapes, smooth and simple. I went out early to dig out the barn and check the animals, and when I turned back toward the house, Della was coming across the yard in her coat and boots, carrying 2 cups. She handed me one. We stood in the yard and drank our coffee and looked at the country, which was, in the way of this land after a storm, both devastated and beautiful at the same time. "I want to tell you something," she said. I waited. "When you made the practical proposal," she said, "I told you we'd stay through winter and talk about what comes next. I want to tell you what comes next." The cold was sharp enough that the coffee steamed between my hands. "We stay," she said. "Not through winter, we stay." I looked at her. "That's the practical part," she said. "The arrangement works. It works for you and it works for us, and the children are—" She stopped. She looked at the snow. "The children are home. I can see it in them. Cal knows where he is for the first time since Orlin died. Emmy has a house to take care of. Toby has—" She stopped again. "Toby has Kettrick," I said. She made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Toby has Kettrick." She looked at her cup. She looked at the flats, white and still under the clean morning sky. "The other part," she said. "The part you told me I had no obligation to." "Yes," I said. "I don't want to be reckless about it," she said. "I'm not a girl and you're not a young man, and we've both got things behind us that have to be respected." "Agreed," I said. "But I also don't want to be a coward about it," she said. "I spent 2 years being careful about everything because everything was fragile and I got tired of it." She looked at me then directly, with the same weather-watching expression she'd turned on me that first day in the road, but something in it had shifted. The caution was still there, but underneath it was something that had decided to trust. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's happened this fall. It would insult us both." "It would," I said. "So," she said. "So," I said. We stood in the cold for a moment, both of us deciding something. "I'd like to court you proper," I said. "No shortcuts. Give it the time it deserves." She looked at me steadily. How long is proper? However long you need it to be, I said. I'm not in a hurry. I've been waiting 6 years for something worth the waiting. I can be patient. Something moved in her expression then, not the almost smile but the real one, which I had only seen once before and which was considerably more dangerous, in the best possible way. You might be surprised, she said, how little time I need. Spring came the way it always does on the Arroyo Flats, not all at once, but in argument back and forth between winter and the warmth, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, until one morning you walk out and the creek is running and the meadowlarks are at it, and the whole country smells like it's waking up from a long sleep. We were married on a Thursday in March, at the county clerk's office in Drover's Notch, with Cal and Emmy and Toby as witnesses. Toby stood beside me through the whole of it with an expression of deep and personal satisfaction, as though this had been his idea, which I suppose in some sense it had been. The clerk asked if we had a ring. I had Clara's ring, which I'd kept in a box in the bureau for 6 years, because throwing it away felt wrong, and wearing it felt wrong, and keeping it in a box felt like the only honest thing. I had taken it out the night before and held it for a long time and thought about Clara, and about the fact that what I felt for Della was not a replacement for what I had felt for Clara, but something different, something of its own, 2 separate real things. The way Toby had said a person could have 2 homes, the one that made you and the one you decided to become. I thought Clara would have said what she always said, which was, don't make it romantic, it only tempts fate. But I also thought she might have liked Della. She liked practical people. I gave Della the ring and she looked at it and then looked at me and said, in a voice low enough that only I could hear, "Are you sure?" I have never been more sure of anything since the day I decided to plant the south pasture in alfalfa, I said. She blinked. Then she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind I had been cataloging all winter, each one filed away against the years of quiet. That is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. You said you didn't want romantic, I said. I said no such thing. You implied it. She put out her hand and I put the ring on it, and the clerk finished the ceremony, and Cal shook my hand with a gravity that nearly undid me, and Emmy hugged her mother and then, after a pause, hugged me, which I hadn't expected, and which I was glad I was ready for. And Toby took my hand as we walked out of the clerk's office and held it all the way to the wagon, and didn't say anything, which from Toby meant everything. We rode back to the Kettrick place in the afternoon, with the first real warmth of the year on our faces and the creek running bright along the road, and Della sat beside me on the wagon bench and didn't say much and I didn't say much, because some things are better held than spoken. When we came into the yard and I stopped the wagon, she looked at the house, the plain, sound, nothing to look at house that Clara had always called the Kettrick place because naming things romantically tempts fate, and she sat with it for a moment. 2 homes, she said. 2 homes, I agreed. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the house, and the children scattered to the barn and the yard the way children do when they know where they belong. I sat for a moment longer on the wagon bench and looked at the cottonwoods along the creek, which were just beginning to go green, and at the house with the smoke rising from the chimney. Emmy had stoked the fire before we left, because Emmy thought ahead, and at the yard, which looked like a yard that had people in it. It was the first time in 6 years the place had looked like that. I climbed down and took the horses to the barn and put them up. I did it slowly, because I wanted to hold the moment a little longer before it became ordinary, and because there is a particular joy in ordinary things that have been absent a long time. Then I went inside. Della was at the stove, Toby was already at the table, Cal was somewhere in the back of the house, and Emmy was setting plates. The house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a room that has people in it who belong there. I hung my coat on the peg by the door, Clara's peg, which I'd kept empty for 6 years, and which still held Clara and always would, and which had room nonetheless, and sat down at the table at my place with my family around me, and did not say a word. Some things a man keeps to himself, not out of coldness, but because the feeling is too big and too hard one, and too real to be reduced to whatever words could hold it. I had planted alfalfa in the south pasture and gotten a good yield. I had fixed the fence on the eastern boundary, and the posts were holding. I had weathered 11 winters alone and 1 December storm with 5 people around my stove, and learned which one I preferred. And a woman I had found stranded on the Arroyo Flats Road one Tuesday in October, with her chin up and her arms folded, and 3 children sitting on a tarp in the wagon bed, had turned my maintained and managed and adequately quiet life into something I had not expected it to ever be again. She turned from the stove and put a cup of coffee in front of me, and her hand rested on my shoulder for a moment, just a moment, warm and certain, and that was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of it.